These are the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm going to suggest that we do a deal. If you will forgive me for not having the magnificent cadences of Dr. King, I will forgive you for not being 250,000 people out there on liquor. I remember in Birmingham, Alabama, when we were in that majestic struggle there, and we would move out of the 16th Street Baptist Church day after day. By the hundreds, we would move out. And Bull Connor would tell them to send the dogs forth, and they did come. And we just went before the dogs singing, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around." Bull Connor next would say, "Turn the fire hoses on." And as I said to you the other night, Bull Connor didn't know history. He knew a kind of physics that somehow didn't relate to the trans physics that we knew about. And that was the fact that there was a certain kind of fire that no water could put out. And we went before the fire hoses. We had known water. If we were Baptist or some other denomination, we had been immersed. If we were Methodist or some others, we had been sprinkled. But we knew water. That could not stop us. And we just went on before the dogs, and we would look at them, and we'd go on before the water hoses, and we would look at it, and we'd just go on singing, "Over my head, I see freedom in the air." And then we would be thrown in the paddy wagons, and sometimes we were stacked in there like sardines in a can. And they would throw us in, and old Bull would say, "Take them off," and they did. And we would just go in the paddy wagon singing, "We shall overcome." And every now and then, we'd get in jail, and then we'd see the jailers looking through the windows, being moved by our prayers, being moved by our words and our songs. And there was a power there which Bull Connor couldn't adjust to. And so we ended up transforming Bull into a steer. And we won our struggle in Birmingham.
So in our sanctuary, it is important to know who is in the house today. So I'm going to do a little informal polling here before I start my formal sermon. And I want to ask, is there anybody out here, because we have to be able to be truthful with each other in this place, who had a moment sometime in the last week of feeling afraid? And anybody who had a moment in the last week of feeling angry? And anybody who had a moment of being really glad to read a sign that just was snarky and fed your jackal self? And anyone who also had a moment of real hope, who recognized that that's not the way forward, that we must move forward in love. So all of that is here in the sanctuary. And I want us to hold that as we go forward. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the reporters who broke the story of Watergate, which began the impeachment of President Richard Nixon, would never cover the Hillsborough, North Carolina Town Council. As a Cub reporter, I really knew that. The meetings were, in a word, dull. I cannot actually remember a single story I wrote from the months of sitting in those court chambers where that council met. And yet I do remember that even with that, there was something in the alchemy of policy and lawmaking that was taking place on the other side of the rail from me, and it was transfixing. On one particular dark night, as I drove my 1974 Volkswagen 412 out of the lightless parking lot after an endless meeting where people did not act from their best selves, I thought to myself, maybe I want to have a different view of this. So a couple years later, I was on the other side of the table. I was working on education and economic development, public policies mostly in the poorest rural areas of our nation. I walked through schools with mostly black students, with raw sewage flowing onto their playgrounds. I listened to workers in poultry factories talk about how their hands were crippled from the repetitive motion of beheading chickens and how their feet were numbed by standing in water and blood day after day. And I listened to tobacco farmers bragging about how they could now, thanks to NAFTA, find a lucrative market in Africa or in South America for the products people in the United States no longer wanted to buy because they knew they were bad for their health. And I listened to people talk about that disconnect between what was law and what was true in their town, their small town, where the big landowners do lip service and spit in the face of the spirit of the law. I joined my first UU church. I learned through that about anti-racism, about systematic oppression, about bias, and how it undermines our democracy, the very foundations of our democracy. And I learned to understand that changing laws doesn't always mean changing attitudes. And I thought to myself, maybe I want to see this from a different point of view. And I began a 10-year discernment, which eventually led to my going to divinity school. In his last speech, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the view from the mountaintop, that transphysics that was in the reading that David gave us. That large view, that giraffe view, that big view was no doubt the reason that his was a nonviolent approach when he defied authorities and occasionally broke laws. Though he worked to change things within the system as much as possible, he was neither a legislator nor a politician. He was deeply, to every fiber of his being, a religious leader. And he understood the idea that sometimes in the world in which we actually live, not the world of our ideals, the world in which we actually live, we sometimes need a place, a holy place of shelter. There are times when human law has not yet caught up with our larger view of who matters and how we all should be treated. And he knew that we all had times when we needed shelter, help, and a place that feels just a little bit safer than the rest. Sanctuary is a religious concept. It is one that was embodied in the Underground Railroad work of the Quakers, the Nazi-era rescue of Jewish people, including the children that Unitarians Waitzel and Martha Sharp saved, the sheltering of immigrants from Central America during the 1980s. Historically, it has meant that religious places sometimes offer actual space within their walls. But in its broadest sense, sanctuary isn't about place at all. It's a way of being that says that we extend the zone of protection around the family of humanity in our times as best we can by whatever means are ours to give. It's a pledge to move together. It is companionship and accompaniment of the deepest kind. And this is the sense in which I believe we are now called to be sanctuary for one another, to salve hearts broken by seeing that while we have indeed changed law after law after law, we have not tamed those jackal hearts of fear and division. Sanctuary, which means that we give ourselves permission here to cry and to curse and to mourn together. And also, in these weeks and months to come, I hope also to laugh and to dance and to create art together, because we're going to need all of that to sustain us, folks, going forward. Sanctuary, which says that we will stay on the path of moving towards that vision of humanity which we hold here, which says that all people have worth and dignity, even when they fall short, even when we fall short. My colleague at Meadville Lombard, the ethicist Sharon Welsh, says this, and I think it's important for our times. The ethic of risk is important, and it's characterized by 3 elements, each of which is essential to maintain resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. Anyone out there feel a sense of overwhelming odds this week? Right? 3 elements. The first, a redefinition of responsible action. Second, a grounding in community. And third, strategic risk-taking. Not every risk, but strategic risk-taking. That's what she says. And this is a time when that ethic of risk, moving into the unknown, seems particularly important to me. I know there are people here today. I know that there are people here today who exercised that ethic of risk yesterday, going out in public for the first time ever in a demonstration to say what they believed. Who here could claim that as the first time that they did that? And who was there? Who was out yesterday? Exactly. All over our area, all over our nation, all over our world. I have thought about and studied about and believe deeply that our Universalist heritage in particular requires us to live deeply into being sanctuary. Our tradition says that we are bound together to do nothing less. This is how they said it in the 19th century. We are bound together to do nothing less than to build together heaven on this earth for all. It's a big goal, and we have not overcome it. We are compelled towards that mountaintop of religion which binds us to truths so large that we haven't yet in our strivings found a way to make them real. There are truths larger than the fears within our hearts, the fears within our neighbors' hearts, and larger sometimes even than the best efforts we have come together as a civilization to do, our best attempts to create order among us. Our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors in this nation, over the years, as I've studied it, were pretty much like most of us sitting in this room today. We believe in order. We believe in being good participants in society. We believe in the rule of law. And given a choice, we would not interrupt as they would not interrupt or offend our neighbors. We'd rather not do that. And yet, if you look at the history of our religious tradition, our history of resistance and witness, what we find is that there have been times when we have been required to touch that place that takes us above the actual realities of where we are in this world. In the times when this country was debating whether it was moral or not to affirm the laws which allowed for slavery, the law which allowed for slavery in this nation. The Reverend Theodore Parker preached with a gun in his pulpit because the Fugitive Slave Act was law, and he knew who was living against that law in his church. He did not enter into the conversation early or willingly. He tried to stay back and ask people to be moderate and not do anything rash. But when the Fugitive Slave Act passed, he knew. He was called by his Unitarian religion to say that sometimes the best efforts of human action are not full in their grasp of basic humanity. We need to remember in this 2017 that counting a person of African descent as 3/4 of a person was the law in this nation. and that the Chinese Exclusion Act, which denied immigrants from China a path ever to citizenship, was law in this nation, and restricting women's rights in all kinds of ways, including the right to manage their own bodies, was law in this nation, and that Executive Order 9022, which forced internship on Japanese Americans, including my family, was done within legal limits and was defended as necessary within the times. Somehow today, it is legal in this nation to allow the imprisonment of people, actual human beings, to be a profit-making enterprise, and one which finds it especially lucrative to trade in immigrants' desperation. Sometimes, when we take that higher view, we can see that we need to be sanctuary in what ways we can. Despite our love and commitment to democracy, sometimes we have to name that at its roots, it was a system created to serve a very small part of our society, and since our founding, we have been struggling to widen those margins. Sometimes our fears and our biases overwhelm the potential of us to make all the right decisions together by consensus, and in those times, we must be willing to stand. We must be a sanctuary for one another. As people of faith, we are bound to a higher aspiration. Reverend William Barber is the leader of the Moral Monday movement. And his book, The Third Reconstruction, is on sale in our hall today because we're reading it as the UUA's common read this year. He said this: "Not only must we know the arguments on all sides of any debate, we must always also seriously consider the questions that are not being asked and their implications for everyone involved." Barber and others are saying that there are times when we need to move into the unknown, times when we need to be what we know no one has yet figured out a way to be, and to put ourselves in that space. These are the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now, he said, of that struggle, which we now know is not at all over. What does all of this mean in the great period of history? It means that we've got to stay together. We've got to stay together and maintain unity. You know, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula for doing it. And what was that? He kept the slaves fighting among themselves. But whenever the slaves get together, something happens in Pharaoh's court, and he cannot hold the slaves in slavery. When the slaves get together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. Now, King says across history to us, now let us maintain unity. The truth is that yesterday some of us were wet by those waters of protest. Very wet by those waters of protest. Very muddied by those waters of protest. But we joined those who were wet by those waters of the fire hoses and the waters of the rivers that had to be crossed in the dead of night before that. The truth is that some of us have long needed sanctuary. Yesterday, millions of people were moving and marching to remind us of that, and yet, unless we are willing to translate that into ongoing action, the moving and resisting will stop. As human beings, we have the ability to comprehend ways of being that we don't even yet know how to embody. We can see it out there. It's on that mountaintop. Many of us who have been speaking out and moving out for years are waiting to see, can we continue to move, and can we continue to move together? Because that's going to involve understanding that the person sitting next to you doesn't have the same truth, and yet we have to figure out how to listen to one another. There are many ways that we can be sanctuary. Listening to someone in this place who spent the rest of their week with people who were celebrating the change of administration in our nation, who have perhaps a narrower view of who matters, is being sanctuary. Being willing to hear why someone is genuinely scared about their safety in our nation is being sanctuary. Singing and dancing and making art together is being sanctuary. Taking beloved conversations here next weekend or helping to host it so that people can do that at a cost they can afford is part of being sanctuary. Becoming an usher or a greeter in these days to make sure that those who are coming into our doors for the first time will feel especially welcome in this hostile time is being sanctuary, and teaching our kids so they know there's an alternative world to the jackal world they're hearing about is being sanctuary. Hosting winter nights, for which we took a collection today, is an act of sanctuary. Going with someone to their disability hearing or to the hearing to have the gender they know in their heart is true, affirmed by law, is being sanctuary. Being willing to have a conversation about how we can shelter people, including the young adults in our nation who know no other country, can remember no other country, but have no legal standing here, and whose names are now on a list held by this administration, is being sanctuary. We need to be sanctuary in every sense of the word. And there's a place for each of us to take our part in affirming people in their wholeness. We need this sanctuary, this place, to be a place where we struggle with ourselves to learn how to live more fully on the side of love, where we confront those places of unconscious bias within us and keep pushing forward. A place where we're willing to do what it takes to interrupt discrimination wherever we find it in our communities and in our world. A place where we recognize and support each other, nurture and celebrate together whatever victories we have so that we can be in this struggle for the long haul, because guess what, folks? It's a long haul struggle. This is what it means to be sanctuary, and this is what it means to make that commitment, and it's different in this week than it was even in last. So let us in this place and in this time search our hearts to see what part of being sanctuary we can do. It might be the sanctuary of presence. It might be the sanctuary of engaging intentionally, nonviolently in our speech and in unity with others who want a different view of humanity. It might be acting to resist despair or interrupt hate, or just to get up out of bed that day you don't want to do it. It might be risking the messiness of living on the side of love and committing to this not just for one day, but as a daily discipline. It might be learning more about why this is our religious heritage and why through this we are tied to our concept of what it means to live in truth. May we, in this sanctuary, remind one another each time we gather of that broader view. And in our own way, may we commit to be sanctuary.